welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming to the latest edition of our fall semester seminar series. We are delighted today to welcome Professor Cohen, Department of Sociology, University of Auckland, BYU, which I always like to identify as occupying land traditionally occupied by the Untitled Chapter Indians. He's here at our invitation to address us on a subject near to my heart, which is the political interpretation of psychiatric categories. One of the things that has motivated him to this study, I also share, and that is a marvel at the proliferation of psychiatric diagnostic categories. I mean, they positively breed like rabbits. So you start out in 1968 with the so-called DSM-1, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, first edition, and it's only that thick. It's about 34 pages long. And now, if you look at the DSM, it's in edition 5, I believe, it's as big as what we call a telephone book in this country. Hundreds of pages long, with hundreds of ways in which one can go crazy. And one has to wonder, is that because we're just so much better at detecting mental illness, or is there another process at work, much more in keeping with how markets proliferate through the extension of product niches, etc.? Well, Bruce will tell us about that. Let me say this, that, on it already. Researching and writing on mental health for over 25 years, his books include Mental Health User Narratives, New Perspectives on Illness and Recovery. Also, this book, Psychiatric Hegemony, A Marxist Theory of Mental Illness. This is a book I use in my psychological anthropology class, and I highly recommend to all of you to buy. It is truly excellent. He teaches courses on the sociologies of mental health, cultural studies, and education, and is currently researching mental health issues in relationship to colonization, the workplace, schooling, and crime. So again, I'm very happy to welcome him here, and I hope you will join me now in for question and answer. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Bruce.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you all for coming. I should say a big thank you to the university for actually funding my trip here and for looking after me in the guest house over the way. And Anthropology, of course, for hosting me so warmly, welcoming me, and of course, goes without saying, Charles and family for actually putting up with my many questions to do with Provo and Salt Lake City in Utah, and of course for initially inviting me here, and for the ongoing discussions and discourse we're having together is fantastic, and it's a wonderful privilege. I'm Bruce Cohen. I'm in the Department of Sociology. I am a sociologist, and the University of Auckland is in New Zealand. And New Zealand is obviously a small bit of land far away from here. And every few years we get to go on these sabbatical trips, which is lovely as an academic, a great privilege. And I've done 2.5 months on the road now. It started in New York and took me through Europe, Venice, Rome, Stockholm, etc. And then LA, and then I ended up in Provo. This is my last leg of my trip, so I saved the best to last, obviously. So, this seems really controversial, I'd imagine. It seems controversial now. I don't think this talk would be anywhere near as controversial 40 years ago or so. In the 1960s and 1970s, this kind of work was pretty kind of run-of-the-mill anthropology, sociology, social science, critical interrogations of different institutions, public institutions. But now it seems controversial, and that's interesting in itself. I got into actually writing about this subject of Marxism and mental health, looking at the mental health industries, as I call them, critically, really because of my students. I set up a class on the sociology of mental health for my postgraduate students, and I encourage them to use different theories, to look at functionalism, obviously, Durkheim, etc., to think about Foucauldian theory, when we do Foucault, discuss, Marxist theory, labelling theory, social constructionism, so many interesting critical theories and conservative theories as well out there that people can draw on engaging with this topic we have here. And the students came back to me and said, well, you've asked us to consider using a Marxist theory of mental illness. We can't actually find this. And, first of all, you kind of think, okay, students not doing their research, etc. Cynical that I am about students, but actually, it turned out they were kind of right. And so I was basically left in this position of thinking, well, if there's not kind of like a book that says Marxist theory on the cover, engages with the whole kind of issues of we've got here with the epidemic of mental illness, then maybe I should do it. So I thought I could give that a go. So, and this is what happens. I now kind of like, it seems to have been well received, and you get invited to speak and do things. And people think you're going to be a hard down the line Marxist. But actually, it's really just filling the gap in a knowledge. It was really doing, I hope, what universities are still there fundamentally to do, which is to question and to kind of try and advance knowledge about issues. I think this issue is pretty straightforward. I would say that is my argument. I'm going to give you some context to where we are. I think people are pretty familiar with the kind of like the expansion in diagnosis and services available when it comes to thinking about the mental health services system critically and so forth. Then I'm going to look at a little bit of history around psychiatry, and we're going to kind of like get to this very old conception that I have from labelling theory from social constructionism, really from the 60s and 70s, which is really about considering mental illness categories as social deviance. But I want to update this, and this is really my contribution, I guess, more than any other bit of the book that I've done, which is really why do we see the expansion of diagnosis, services, etc., in this period in our history, in this society that we live in, which is a capitalist society, of course, a society of fundamental inequalities. So this is the context to start us off. Like I say, but people might be aware of these issues already. I just want to kind of like make sure we're all on the same page here. So we should know, I think, that mental illness rates are rising, and they've risen dramatically, particularly over the last 40 years. Robert Whittaker has done a good few books, Mad in America, also Anatomy of an Epidemic. He's a Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist, and his books are really good on looking at mental illness in America. And he notes using some statistics which are quite kind of like the 1955 one is problematic, because basically when you're talking about those who are considered disabled by mental illness, you were talking about people who are incarcerated in psychiatric hospitals. And of course we've moved on from that period to a period of deinstitutionalization since then. So anyway, he has the figure of 1 in 468 Americans hospitalized in 1955. That moves on to 1 in 184 disabled by mental illness in 1987, and in 2007, 1 in 76. I think these rates are put in, so you've got kind of like 6 times more people being disabled by mental illness than there were in 1955. In 20 years, he notes, the number of children that are disabled by mental illness rose 35-fold in America. It's kind of like, particularly with youth mental illness issues, it's skyrocketed. So currently, according to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 50% of you Americans will be diagnosed with a mental illness or disorder at some point in your lives. So more than half, that's awesome. 1 in 5 Americans will experience a mental illness in any given year. 1 in 5 children, either currently or at some point in their life, have a serious debilitating mental illness. And 1 in 25 Americans live with a serious mental illness, such as typically schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. The estimates vary, but in terms of the global rates of mental illness, we're getting on for 1 billion people currently affected by a mental or behavioural disorder. That's according to the Global Burden of Disease Collaborative Network in 2016. Depression is now, according to the World Economic Forum, depression is the #1 cause of ill health and disability worldwide. Stunning figures. The conclusion we take from this, then, is there is an epidemic of mental illness, and we hear this a lot in the press from the experts and so forth. Most of us will soon, it seems, be in some way mentally ill, will be crazy. Mental health services are also growing to try and meet the need of this growing population. We know that psychiatric and psychological staff and services are under-resourced currently. There are 26,000 psychiatrists in America, for instance, yet more are needed. It's an aging profession. Many are near retirement. It's problematic to actually try and fill these gaps in these professions at the moment. We know that there are treatments for mental illness, such as drugs, therapy, counselling, etc. These are all increasing. The current US spend on mental health problems is $100 billion per year. Not insignificant cost, obviously. The power and influence of the mental health professions are, according to Davies, growing at a remarkable rate as well. What are the explanations given then, so why we have such a kind of this current epidemic, and why services as well as treatments as well as like diagnosis and people suffering from mental illnesses have increased? Biomedical model, biomedicine would tell us that basically, because we have more precise science, the science is better than ever before, it's progressed. So we've uncovered new forms of mental illness. For instance, we, as Charles mentioned, the first DSM, which was in 1952. There were 106 mental illnesses in that first edition. DSM-5, published in 2013, has 372 mental illnesses. We also have new technologies, biomedicine tells us, for identification and for treatment, such as, we have the brain scans now, we have refined SSRIs, the latest kind of like versions of antidepressants and so on. That's biomedicine's view. Social model supports this, but of course says, well, actually what's happening, of course, is we have growing inequalities between the rich and the poor, for instance. We have kind of growing levels of poverty. We have a kind of like more stressful environment. We have more temporary work. So basically environmental and social factors. We also have a worse kind of environment generally, including the air we breathe, the traffic, etc., etc. So many more stresses that can lead to more mental illness now than previously. That's how the social model goes. And we have increasing social inequalities generally in the area of society. This is why they're going up. We also have epidemiological work in the public health field over the past decades, which has shown that there's a lot of mental illness that's not getting treated out there currently. So basically, what we have is the need for yet more services because there are people not seeking treatment currently. There's more public awareness as well of mental illness. There's more kind of people are not so stigmatized in possibly going to their doctors, going to a psychiatrist, a therapist, and so forth, and actually seeking help. So people are more accepted, and this can also have an effect on the visibility of actually mental illness in our society currently. So conclusions we can make then. There's more mental illness than ever before that we've ever had in our history in Western society. There are better methods of detection and treatment. There's more services, and there's more public awareness of the issues. And here comes the sociologist, cynical humanist, however. Key issue that I think should concern us as social scientists, as citizens of the planet, as academics and as students, which is how has mental illness actually become so commonplace in society despite the contested nature of the mental illness causation and treatment, the actual scientific base that is then promoted as truth of what mental illness is. This is Andrew Scott. This is his comment, which summates a lot of he's a sociologist at San Diego, and really kind of sums up harms that many of us critical scholars have when we look at the current evidence on mental illness. And this is now controversial. It wouldn't have been so controversial, like I say, in previous periods. He says the frantic efforts to distinguish ever larger numbers and types of subtypes of mental illness come to seem like an elaborately disguised game of make-believe. After all, despite the plethora of claims that mental illness is rooted in faulty biochemistry, deficiencies and surpluses in this or that neurotransmitter, the product of genetics, and one day may be traceable to biological markers, the etiology, that is the causation, of most mental illness remains obscure, and its treatments are largely symptomatic and generally of dubious efficacy. These are not things that people like to hear, but these are things that we have to engage in as critical scholars. To follow this up, summation of further evidence for you cynics. A recent review of the science behind the psychiatric discourse by Bonnie Burstow, scholar in Canada, concluded that no biological sign has ever been found for any mental disorder. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association's committee, when they moved towards discussion of I should point out for you who don't know actually, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM for short. And it's the American Psychiatric Association's Bible, as they call it. It's their medical manual. So if it's in there, it's a mental disorder. If it's not in there, it's not a mental disorder. And it is the ultimate authority globally. It is the dominant document. We use it in New Zealand as you guys use it here. And the task force for the 5th edition that came out in 2013, they started work on the 5th edition in 2002. The members of that committee actually admitted the etiology, the causation of mental disorders, remain unknown. The field of mental health still does not have a biological marker or genetic test that can be used for diagnostic purposes. A bit of a problem when you're actually going about constructing the latest version of the medical document. Further research has shown that psychiatrists still cannot distinguish between those who are actually sane and those who are insane, or those who are mentally ill, those who are not mentally ill, as it was shown by Rosenhan and many other people from these studies in the 70s and so forth. Yeah. So consequently, it failed to still define their area of expertise. To finish this off, one last piece of research from Kate Alsop et al. And this is because this study came out this year in a noted, this is in Psychiatry Research Journal. And what they concluded, looking at major categories in the DSM, schizophrenia, affective disorders, etc., is that psychiatric diagnoses are scientifically worthless as tools to identify discrete mental disorders. Damning, really, information. How do we understand then this kind of like what psychiatry does and what mental illness is? At least kind of like what the psychiatric discourse is and what its purpose is. Well, I think we can go back to Labeling theory and others and think about mental illness as social deviance. A quick look at the history of psychiatry, it's just some classic examples, raises some issues for us when we think about the contemporary setting. The first one, this is from, sorry, the top images I'm looking at now, drapetomania. Anybody heard of the drapetomania mental illness? That's really interesting. Okay, this is fun then. So drapetomania. This was a mental illness that Samuel Cartwright in the 19th century in the south of the USA discovered at the time of slavery. It was basically drapetomania is the mental illness or mental disease of slaves running away from their owners. So it's a mental illness if you run away from your owner. What Samuel Cartwright said, so basically, you know, the owners are obviously very benevolent, and why would a slave choose to run away from them? Well, it has to be some sort of pathology. This is what Samuel Cartwright got taken up by kind of decisions in the South and so forth. He suggested, of course, there was some kind of like a biological-based reason why these slaves would choose to run away from the benevolent owners. And what he suggested was, well, treatment for that could be the cutting off of a toe. And if they continue to try to run away from their owners, then like you really need to think about cutting off one of their foot. Drapetomania, look it up. It's a really interesting mental illness, obviously. Not with us now, I'm glad to say. Another one, in the middle here, we have kind of this curious illustration here. Hysteria. Who's heard of hysteria? I mean, we're still using the concept of that. Okay, yes. So this is also a defunct mental illness now. It's no longer with us, although arguably there is a histrionic personality disorder in the DSM-5 that looks a lot like hysteria. So basically this was caused by, it was theorized, the wandering womb. This is what psychiatrists and physicians said. The wandering womb. So again, biological theory to this. Basically the problem was when women kind of like were not kind of like anymore kind of just staying with the house chores and looking after the children and setting the table and meeting guests, and actually was saying, actually I'd like to go outside. I'd like to maybe kind of like read a newspaper, read a book, kind of maybe get an education even, these kind of things. Well, it was theorized that these women were suffering from hysteria, which was the wandering womb. The womb, basically women got too excited or read too much and stuff like this. Basically the womb would start to wander away from its natural position. It would end up kind of possibly choking the woman and so forth. And the cures were things like bed rests. Not reading. Don't read anything. There's classic examples of don't pick up a pen and paper and stuff like this because this will agitate your condition, etc. Of course, the illustration I'll point out briefly. If you've seen, there's a film called Hysteria with Rupert Everett. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it. It wasn't that popular. Anyway, kind of like it's worth a look. This kind of goes through this whole thing. One of the theories they had about hysteria was basically, well, the kind of like the biology is it's not getting enough activity, and this is kind of like the womb style, and this is causing kind of like problems. So doctors ended up doing basically having to manually, you can kind of guess the rest. But this led to, funnily enough, the invention of the vibrator. So, swings and roundabouts. Anyway, so these seem ridiculous, but think about the current context, and there's plenty of, we'll come back to it, some current diagnoses. Likewise, until 1973, homosexuality was a mental illness. Curious that that actually changed, not due to any scientific innovations on behalf of psychiatry, but actually due to pressures within and without the American Psychiatric Association. Basically, both supporters of gay rights within psychiatry, but also actually psychiatrists who are gay, but also from outside from gay rights group in the 1970s. and also it was around the same time it was being decriminalised across Western societies as well. Interesting that these things happening, and sociologists of deviance such as myself think it's more than coincidence that this actually happens. So what are we looking at here? Well, we can argue that this is not actually biological, but rather a social disease. A social disease of the sort being social deviance. Psychiatric professionals, arguably labelling theories that look at this in the past, they police norms and values of society. They label behaviour that falls outside these norms and values as mentally ill, as some form of mental illness. I should point out as well, a lot of the scholarship on this critical work I draw on here is actually from psychiatrists and psychologists and kind of people who are kind of medical professionals and so forth. Sadly, as a sociologist, not many of these scholars are sociologists. Shorter at the top, he's a respected, dead now, medical historian. And he admitted himself, psychiatry, to be sure, is the ultimate rule maker of what is acceptable behaviour in a society through its ability to specify what counts as crazy. Joanna Moncrief, UK psychiatrist, very good, interesting work, worth having a look at, notes that psychiatric diagnosis can be understood as functioning as a political device. This is in the sense that it legitimates a particular social response to abhorrent behaviour of various sorts, but protects that response from any democratic challenge. Basically, when you look at medicalisation, making the non-medical into a medical condition, it's a very good way of depoliticising basically somebody. If you basically say, you don't know what you're talking about, you want labour rights, you must be mad, etc. It's a great way, and it's been done through the history of the 19th and 20th centuries. So what we have then is critical scholars focusing on the medicalisation of deviant behaviour by psychiatry. We have Peter Conrad's work, for instance, on ADHD as the medicalisation of unruly school children, and he indeed argues that adult ADHD is the medicalisation of underproductiveness in the workforce. We can think about then mental health system as an institution of social control, something that labelling and social constructionist scholars talked about often in the 60s and 70s. Psychiatrists are then, according to people like Howard Becker, moral entrepreneurs. They are rule makers, but they're especially rule enforcers here. I mean, I found a great quote from Howard Becker. Good old Howie. Is he still alive? I think he probably still is. Sorry?
He is.
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? He must be in his 90s or something.
He is.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah, and he plays the piano. It's like what a guy. Anyway, sorry. Good old days of sociologists actually doing critical work. It's a long time ago. So he states, first, moral entrepreneurs, they say that by reason of their efforts, the problem that they deal with is approaching a solution. Think about biomedicine now. We're progressing. We're getting to more defined scanners, machines that go ping, etc. We're really kind of making progress here. But in the same breath, he states, they say that the problem is perhaps worse than ever. And that's very interesting when you look at where we are with the mental health field. That basically, the kind of levels of mental illness, worse than ever. Though, through no fault of their own. And it requires a renewed and increased effort to keep it under control. So enforcement officials can be more vehement than anyone else in their insistence that the problem they are supposed to deal with is very much still with us. In fact, it's more with us than ever before. And in making these claims, says Howie, enforcement officials provide good reason for continuing the existence of the position they occupy. So, why the expansion is my issue. If we can all agree now, I'm sure we can, that basically mental illness is social deviance. It's relative, culturally and historically relative. Why are we seeing the expansion in it? Because Capitalism requires the mental health system and psychiatric diagnosis more than they did previously, and more than ever. This is my theory. The rise of the mental health industry in the last 40 years can be explained through consideration of how psychiatric knowledge has been aligned with dominant capitalist norms and values. So that is, an expert scientific discourse has been constructed which speaks to our concerns, our everyday concerns within neoliberal society. So, for example, our anxieties about underperforming with the increasing unstable workplace, even as educators, we're experiencing this. The concerns we have for our kids, getting on in school, and the more stress they have, actually, about getting on. All the problems we experience in balancing maybe work responsibilities with child rearing and day-to-day domestic chores in the home. That's just a few examples. And I've got some pertinent factors here that play into this. What we've had with neoliberalism, a move from, of course, industrial to a knowledge-based service sector economy. We've seen a move from, not so much in America, maybe, you can argue that point, from a social democratic, social welfare state to a more individualized state where the responsibility falls less to the state. This is particularly true when you look at neoliberalism and the dynamics in Europe, UK, where you've seen basically a move from real kind of like social welfare systems cutting back on cuts, welfare services to the people, and more responsibility focused on the individual. There's, of course, a fluid kind of labour markets. There's a flexible labour force with set of personal, social applied skills necessary. There's a need within this context, to be Foucauldian for a minute, to have more self-surveillance and a governance from a distance, as Nicholas Rose talks about, actually, here. A governance from a distance. There's a need for us to actually ourselves manage ourselves, to say, I might have a problem, I need to seek help, rather than actually to look to your community, to look to your environment, to look to the structures of society to say, I think we've got serious problems here. This is why the work, basically our work becomes so stressful and stuff. The response is now, basically, if you're tired of work, you need to seek help, buddy. You don't you don't go to your union, because it probably doesn't exist. You don't go to your employer because you might cause trouble and get fired. You don't go to outside parties. You actually go and seek help for what is fundamentally structural issues here. So basically, what I'm saying is psychiatry basically normalizing abnormal relations and pathologizing any resistance to power differentials to make fundamental equalities appear natural and common sense in this society at this time. It's a part of individual failing rather than as a result of inherent structural processes of capital. And we see this stuff more and stuff, we see this in our workplaces, I think, as students, as kind of academics. I get it as well, in New Zealand we're kind of constantly getting, Mental Health Awareness Day, or, get your back massages here and stuff, don't be stressed, kind of have a fun half an hour with a cake and a cup of tea, and then go back and work your socks off, etc. Lots of these wellness and other ideas relate into this, which is not about kind of actually, there's no kind of Mental Health Awareness Day where they have, let's collectively organise, let's actually consider strike action, again, to actually get higher wages in this place. That, strangely enough, doesn't happen. My theory as a whole, then, with this rather clumsy diagram, is that we are in a system of psychiatric hegemony now. We need to understand the institution, the mental health system, through structural theory, I believe. It's not the individual or the group per se that directs and orders the formal or informal rules of the organisation, but rather it's the wider social and economic forces within capitalism. I don't want to go through all the literature that supports my argument. As Charles says, my book's available in all good booksellers, but also I believe in the library, and it's probably cheaper to get from the library. But it basically follows this simple idea from Marx and Engels, which is about, every epoch, the ruling ideas are the ideas of from the ruling classes. These don't just emerge, in our institutions. We can't take these for granted. These actually come from somewhere. So, while Marx gave primacy to the economic infrastructure, the superstructure, as he termed it, serves an important role in reproducing and the proliferation of ruling class ideas. And drawing on Gramsci and Althusser, neo-Marxist scholars, we can think about a subtle ideological hegemony by which, Althusser notes, institutions of civil society such as the school, the church, family, and of course the health system actually promote ideas and beliefs that support the established order. So this is a nice little sop to the people, rather than through direct control, through kind of the army, police, etc. Actually now we have a more subtle form of power. Hegemony works through consent and persuasion, and it proliferates through every institution in society. And it's the intellectuals, importantly, the professionals, who are responsible for the legitimization of ruling class ideas within the public sphere. So they're articulating these ideas as normal common sense as well. And that's not to, as Navarro says on this, I won't actually read it out because it's quite long, as you see. Navarro, a Marxist medical scholar. But actually points out there's actually fluidity and flexibility. There's room for dissent. It's not like basically the American Psychiatric Association sit down and say, what are the ruling class values today? And then we'll put them in the next medical edition like that. It's more subtle, and there are points of resistance, and there are kind of disagreements. And I believe that actually helps us understand the points of resistance, and also the way psych professionals, like let's say psychiatrists and psychologists, have some fundamental disagreements, of course, about the ideas about normal psychology, mental health, etc. But also within psychiatry, there's two wings, people might know. There's one that's the psychodynamic wing, or the kind of the groovy therapist sort of thing. And the other one is the biomedical, and it's the biomedical psychiatrists that dominate right now. Hence, we have the use of various kind of pharmaceutical treatments. Okay, that's all very well, Bruce, but actually, can you back it up with anything like some evidence? The answer is yes, I can. Let's go for it. I argue in my book, and there's chapters on each of these issues, that we can particularly see an expansion of psychiatric hegemony into the fields of work, into the home environment, and into the school, into the education system. And here's just like a brief examples of diagnosis matching with this kind of some of these ideas. I argue that there's a normalization of patriarchal relations. Women have traditionally served important functions in capitalism, obviously as reproducers of the workforce, as primary carers in the home, more recently as part of the flexible economy, but continuing to be overrepresented in low-wage jobs. These patriarchal relations confine women to second-class status, obviously, and the mental health system serves to normalise gender inequalities as part of this, as inevitable, as necessary, while punishing deviations from this. So what we have is more and more actually, highly gendered psychiatric diagnoses with each edition of the DSM. And here's just a few. There's postpartum depression. There's a wonderful premenstrual dysphoric disorder, some new mental illness in DSM-5. Borderline personality disorder, many psychiatrists themselves say this should be in the wastebasket category. The crazy female orgasmic disorder, amongst many more. I just want to skip through this because I realise kind of like a time skipping on, I want kind of like a decent Q&A. Or at least a chance for you to kind of like throw stuff at me, maybe. So the idea of enforcing the positive worker. Social anxiety disorder was previously social phobia, which was, as Christopher Lane has pointed out, the medicalization of shyness. Very interesting book there. We have autism, adult ADHD. Basically, work has just been added to ADHD in the DSM-5. So you don't, it's not just symptoms include losing homework, but symptoms include losing assignment documents, office documents, etc., as well as homework, to make it relevant to adults as well as children. And we wonder why adult ADHD is on the increase. There's more C work involved in schools now than there used to be. Less call for people to shout out the answer, be boisterous, etc. in those contexts. As a result, we have ADHD to deal with deviants and perpetrators here. As Graham, a scholar in Australia, has nicely pointed out, and if you have a look at the DSM-5 and have a look at ADHD in there, you look at the symptoms, and it's pretty obvious. These are all demarcated on the work and school environments. Some of these seem like incredible. How did I not look at this document before? But anyway, do now, because it's really fascinating. I did a simple bit of analysis in the book. This is my only original research. Sorry about that. All the rest of it's all kind of critical secondary kind of research and data. What I did do is I did kind of text searches on each version of the DSM. It starts with number 1, as you see, in 1952. It ends with the current DSM-5 in 2013. This is a graph that shows how often, these are absolute numbers, how often working or worker, home and housework or school is actually mentioned in the symptomologies of the DSM when all the mental illness is looked up. And this is what you get. Now, okay, the DSM, you could say, well, the DSM is bigger than it was, so there will be more of these similar words in it. Although we see a departure with the DSM-3, of course, as well in 1980. The start of neoliberalism, more than coincidence, I say. But what we can do here is actually compare DSM-4 TR, that's a text revised version, with the DSM-5. These are similar sized documents. So they've got a similar number of words in them. What we see is an increase of a third in the use of work, working, working, and school with DSM-5, and a quarter with home and housework. Sorry, I'm skipping a bit quickly over this. This is where you see those kind of words coming up. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, basically, some scholars argue, I agree with them, the medicalization of menses, of periods, of the cycle. It's pretty incredible diagnosis, also worth a look. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, symptoms associated with clinically significant distress or interference with work and school, usual social activities, relationships, and lovely, they say, for example, avoidance of social activities, decreased productivity and efficiency at home, school, and at work. And you can read the ADHD one, kind of like a classic case, which has home, school, and work in it, and so forth. Davies, a psychologist in the UK, I'm finding his work quite useful actually, and he's a very nice guy. He used to be a ballerina, I found out actually. Trained as a ballerina, amazingly enough, and then gave it all up. Had a bit of a kind of crisis, and now he's a scholar and therapist in London. And a really nice guy, if you ever get beaten. Well, one thing he's kind of like, he found was what you have with the DSM-3, that actually first published in 1980, like I say, is for the first time, he argues, you see the medicalization of underproductivity. So you basically have occupational functioning, and you see that mentioned in the DSM-3. Before DSM-2, there's no mention, but suddenly occupational functioning is there over more than 100 times, and so forth. So you see this kind of discourse of neoliberalism begin to seep into these diagnoses. I'm going to conclude, and you'll all be happy about that, I'm sure. Cutchins and Kirk, a couple of American scholars, state that the development of psychiatric classifications in the United States has been shaped primarily by external demands and broad social forces, rather than by the desires or felt needs of practicing clinicians. I think neoliberalism and mental industry, looking at this expansion, are a really good combination. When I say really good combination, I mean the kind of, as a scholar and analyst, I would say they're lovely. The profession has always been deeply conservative. We saw a bit of history. They naturalise inequalities as inevitable. They pathologise deviance and deviant behaviour as being signs of mental illness. Neoliberal norms and values promoted in the DSM then, I argue, have served a usefulness in being able to depoliticise fundamental inequalities in Western capitalism. They individualise social and economic issues. And I believe only Marxist theory can explain what we've actually witnessed. Of course I do. The proliferation of mental illness categories and self-regulatory behaviour, self-labelling, we actually think maybe we've got ADHD, etc. And that happens much more now. Psychiatric power and the limits of that power, the internal and external conflicts and threats to psychiatry, points of medicalisation. We saw the disappearance of Asperger's syndrome, interesting enough, in the DSM-5, DSM-4 to DSM-5, and links to other capitalist enterprise. The most obvious being big pharma, basically, the selling, the surplus value created by selling the antidepressants and antipsychotics. However, I would say, like the end of any good social science paper, there is a need for more research. And that's just not a kind of usual soft, but really, hopefully you're kind of thinking, I haven't heard this kind of talk before, or anything like it. And that's a shame, but good if you did, and hopefully you're not horrified. But actually you're inspired to take my book apart, take my knowledge, take it somewhere else, and further advance knowledge in this area and be critical on the subject. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
We have time for questions, so please, if you have one, ask it.
Oh, okay. I have a question. So, where do we? Oh, sorry, I'm up here. So, where, in terms of both like research directions and then also practical applications, where do we go from here, or where would you like to? Does that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's certainly research I'd like to do. Although, as I mentioned to postgraduate students at lunchtime today, that puts 6 months or a year or longer on the time you get to publish something. And publish or be damned in this system. I actually prefer to just sit on my arms and write stuff which is quicker. What I would like to do, I think there's a lot of really good stuff to be done to test out ideas like this, how much validity they have, with actually going out there in the field and seeing, well, what does actually these professionals do? How do they actually make sense of these? We kind of have an idea how they'll justify the expansion of kind of categories, etc., and so forth. But actually, I think day to day, going back to our kind of anthropological kind of work and doing ethnographic studies, an observational study, such as those that Charles has done, is really important, because we really kind of have a lack of, this, it's constantly changing, of course, and we need to have more of this work where we see, well, how do they make classifications then, Cohen? How do they actually go about it? Maybe they're just, etc. So that's what I'd like to do. There is kind of like attitudinal stuff. It's funny how much money and research is put into this area now. Of course it is. I haven't mentioned the kind of like stipends and stuff. It's all rising here. It's a great area to get into to get some money if you're not like me. But where's the stuff to do to look at the professional? To see how to see how they make diagnostic classifications, see how the DSM committees work, etc. I know this takes more kind of like negotiation with gatekeepers, but I think that would be really cool.
That's what I wanted to ask about. Has anyone published anything about the inner workings of these DSM revision meetings where they actually decide to either get something out or put something new in?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so there have been. So I mentioned Christopher Lane. He did the work on social anxiety disorder, social phobia, shyness. So he interviews members of the DSM committee. He's not actually there at the time, but he's kind of like he's doing a, then I guess like looking historically back at this and how it happened with documents and with interviews. There are insiders such as like, there's a great book called They Think You're Crazy. They Think You're Crazy? I think something like that, by Kaplan, Paula Kaplan, I think. And she was on this committee that where they ended up having this PMDD category, premenstrual blah blah, and she got chucked off it. Basically, they brought her in. They do this quite often on these committees. They bring in experts in the particular field for these subcommittees. You know, so okay, we'll get kind of like a good kind of like psychologist who's working in this area, etc. So she records her observations and stuff, and how she basically said, funny enough, this is going to medicalise women even more than we've already done with this disorder. What do you know? They kicked her off. We've now got PMDD. So there are a number of those. And also, interesting enough, you have the real heads, the chairs of the DSM-5 committees, who after they've left, funnily enough, they start writing critical work about the DSM and how we make diagnosis and how big pharma is involved in all this decision making and stuff. So most recently, I guess, is Alan France, who's got this book called Saving Normal. He was the chair of the DSM-4 committee, which was 1994. And yeah, in his Saving Normal book, and you can read his blogs, you can Google him now, and he'll be on there basically saying, we're medicalising everyday behaviour, it's a scandal. And I'm thinking, you did a lot of that with DSM-4, that was you. You know, taking money from pharmaceutical companies, etc. But so yeah, we do have.
And then quickly, just one other thing: who determines how often it's revised? They themselves do, and do they do it on an as-needed basis, where they say, well, you know, people are really being deviant in some ways that we didn't anticipate, and now we need to come up with a new category, or is it just on a regular basis on principle?
It's not on a regular basis, but it's interesting. It's become a kind of a 15-year process, really, together with the text revised version, sometimes an in-between version. Yes?
Oh, I just had a different question, but you...
Oh, right, okay. Sorry, I thought you were going to fill in more information on that. Yeah, so it's a work in production, so you hear, like, you get newspaper things about new diagnosis, etc. all the time. But, so these are kind of like, there are kind of like various levels, it seems, of like mental illness coming along, like internet gaming disorder is in the appendix of the DSM-5. It might be a real mental illness in the next edition and stuff, but it might disappear. So, yeah, it's kind of like it's on this circulation. It's up to the APA, really, when they do it.
So where do, like, mental illnesses that fit into, like, the marketplace, how do those work in? Because, like, there's, like, one that's dependent personality disorder, which is the opposite of the shyness disorder. Mm. Like, how does that fit in if it's, like, a positive trait?
Okay, so you're saying, how does that actually fit into my theory?
Yeah.
Okay, so dependent, not that I've looked at dependent personality, sounds interesting now.
Yeah, I just actually Googled it, sorry. They rely on other people for comfort, reassurance, advice, and support.
Yeah, so you've basically got, you could feed this into my kind of like positive worker thing.
Mm-hmm.
These people have problems. We need to be more agrarious. We need to be more outgoing. We need to have more social skills. We can't kind of depend on others. So it's about kind of our work, you know. So that's the deviancy. There is that dependency on it. So that's the way. It's a great argument. No, I'm just saying because of mine, but it's actually you can kind of like apply it to all these disorders if you give it a little bit of thought. Testing it is more of an issue.
It's worth noting that in the case of dependent personality disorder, 10 times more women are diagnosed with that condition than men. It's an axis 2 disorder, according to the APA, personality disorder. And if you look for its counterpart on the male side, that would be narcissism. 10 times more men are diagnosed with narcissism than women. So the entire personality diagnosis process is a cultural commentary on gender more than it is anything else, in my view.
And as I mentioned before, there's a number of those as well, yeah, highly gendered. Yeah.
Actually, I'll let the student go first.
Hello. I'm just wondering where do like severe mental health disorders fit into this, like, you know, severe depression or, you know, severe bipolar or severe schizophrenia? Is that, in your opinion, does that fit into like this psychiatric hegemony?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I know we've talked previously about this, but yeah, unfortunately, like, yes, every category has the potential to do that. Okay, there's some references on schizophrenia. Let's take the schizophrenia example. It's interesting when you look just at that category as a mental illness, because that seems like, as Thomas Sachs talked about, and he's written a book on schizophrenia. He calls it the sacred. It's a sacred symbol of psychiatry. I.e., it's kind of like, we need this if nothing else. This has to be real, otherwise our science really looks dubious. But the funny thing is, towards like the recent DSMs, given that, in terms of, if you look at the figures for kind of these serious mental illness, such as bipolar and schizophrenia and so forth, they've stayed really static. If anything, they've gone down in the population. It's just been these common mental illnesses that have appeared and risen, etc. So they've kind of been lost. So there's that issue. It's kind of like, in terms of research and stuff, what, you know, actually kind of like they are kind of lost as a group. But also, there was some plans and some psychiatrists say we should get rid of schizophrenia because we cannot actually successfully define what it is. Beyond, I think, this idea of delusions, illusions, hearing voices, etc. The problem is we've had a lot of kind of like the Hearing Voices Network has been established to say we are not mentally ill just because we hear voices, and we've also had, of course, the cultural and historical specificity of hearing voices itself. You hear them in church, speaking to God, you're not mentally ill. Go outside the doors, you are mentally ill. Yeah.
There's a really interesting study on it called The Protest Psychosis, specifically
I love this book.
Schizophrenia, tracking diagnoses of it in the 40s and 50s, and it was primarily a diagnosis made in terms of housewives that were not happy. You know, I came home from work today and she just didn't feel like making dinner anymore. In through the civil rights movement, and he documents it becoming how it transformed to primarily an angry black man disease. So the category itself remained, or at least the name remained as a diagnosis. His argument, what he shows from this particular, it was an asylum that was shut down with the war, was that the specific way that it's being applied in the diagnosis. What it came to me to prove that diagnosis shifted drastically within about 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, Jonathan Metzl's book, Protest Psychosis, really interesting book. I recommend it highly. Yeah.
I just had a comment that would kind of bounce off of the students. Before I went into academia, I worked as a court-appointed medical care facilitator for people who had been diagnosed with mental illnesses in the court system, and most of them were sex offenders. And I remember very distinctly a woman who I had been appointed to do as her medical advocate. I'm in the ER with her, and she's having a total breakdown. And it was this amazing situation of she's yelling at the heating vents, telling the heating vents, the person in the heating vents, to stop controlling her. And then immediately a doctor comes in and says, "We got to take control of this situation." let's give her a shot. And it was just really shocking. It was that this woman was really tired of basically every single decision in her life being completely controlled. And she's literally screaming at the heating vent to stop controlling me. And the doctor says, well, it's not that she has a legitimate complaint about being controlled. Obviously she's mentally ill. And now we've got to get her, like, numb her to the point where she can't speak anymore. So that's probably kind of along the lines of what you're saying. It's the social control.
Yeah, and a really great example. Thank you.
I do have a question though about a harder one. Alzheimer's and dementia. So, like, I have a hard time thinking that that's necessarily deviance. I mean, I can understand that people with Alzheimer's can have deviant-like symptoms, but I think part of the claim is they're saying, like, look, my memory is lapsing. And it's not like they're being deviant, it's just they can't remember who they are, or they can't remember things. And it's true, we don't really actually know exactly what causes these things. But it's hard to say that that's just the result of worker relations, particularly when a lot of these people are no longer in a worker kind of relationship. They may have been retired or something along those lines. I'm just kind of wondering how would you square those kinds of circles?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and give you an answer. And that's a really interesting, obviously, a growth area of an aging population. So this is another area that's really good and interesting to look at. Something that biomedical psychiatry does is actually appropriate conditions that actually do have biological etiology foundation to them. And actually, I always get them up, dementia or Alzheimer's. It is one of those, I believe. But what has happened, nevertheless, is a kind of medicalization of later life, where you're seeing a drop in the age at which you can have Alzheimer's, which is very interesting, which brings it into a kind of older work, eventually an older worker thing. And a friend of mine, Emma Zeras, has actually written specifically on this issue briefly about basically, and you kind of like you're seeing more of this, the kind of creep of younger and younger age groups. So yeah, that's also an interesting condition. But I have to move on to another question.
Yeah, so as I was listening, some of what sounds like is happening is like just like Marxist enclosure, right? Like behavior that wasn't in the market, like a kid just not focusing at school is now all of a sudden something you can pay doctors for and buy medicine for.
Yeah.
So kind of like really strong kind of like capitalist incentive to, like increase your capital and make money. So I was wondering though if like there's differences between that expansion in like a more like socialist medicine country versus a like state medicine versus like America, where it's just kind of like the Wild West and no one can pay for anything, but we still do it anyways. Like, are there differences in like this expansion?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a good area for research. It works really well in this society. My theory works really well in America. Of course it does. Yeah, it's kind of like it feels like it becomes more subtle in a system where you actually, for instance, in the UK has the National Health Service, and then you don't have the same dynamics. It seems not as strong dynamics of actually, the search for more maximising profit, surplus value, etc. Within that system. It is still there, though, that being said, even though we don't have that kind of stuff about the insurance companies being directly involved in health cover and unique diagnosis and blah, 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 so everybody's, getting on the gravy train of mental health. And the thing is about my theory is it's not just about the economics. So I think the economics you can apply to a society, like I say, I think it does work best here. But there are also other issues about the contestations and the conflict professionals have between themselves. The self-labelling that we see happen across Western society, the way we see psychiatry expanding into new markets, into Asia, into China. Actually China's, I saw a report a few years ago that, China's got hardly any Western trained psychiatrists, and 1 billion people obviously, and hardly any. And there's estimates from researchers that there could be, let's say, 1% of the population have autism. That's an incredibly large market. I mean, China's going to be a large market now, so part of the kind of like psychiatric expansion, which is it's kind of frightening in ways, but it's understandable.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
About what you would suggest be done? So, the DSM homosexuality case is a really interesting one because it supports the general theory, but in ways it directly undermines Moncrief's claim to no democratic input into what's so it does both at the same time. And I think this ties in with this is just a variation on Fanon, who's doing something very similar. But these things can both be structural, and people can really be sick. That this is something that Fanon is saying. So I'm wondering, in terms of ideas for how we might go about remedying this. If it is structural, but people really are also, I mean, Marx himself would say the same thing. People really are.
He did.
Alienated.
Yeah, a lot, and you're right, and actually that's a good point to say that most Marxist scholars that actually bother to engage with this field say something different from me. It's actually kind of basically, capitalism makes you sick, and it's making us sicker, and so that's the explanation. The problem with that explanation goes back to my kind of like my social constructionist work, I guess, but also kind of like the evidence. We kind of like fundamentally we have a serious problem, and I think away from my kind of particular Marxist critique, look at Robert Whittaker, who comes from a journalist. Basically, he's an investigative journalist on this issue, and he writes about this in psychiatry has failed the American people. How can we be the most advanced, richest country with the most advanced technology, and we have the worst rates of mental illness? How can that be? And the way he goes about looking at that evidence systematically leads him to the same place as myself, which is, as a humanist, you kind of say, the problem is we don't know what this thing is. We honestly don't know what it is, but it's not what psychiatry says it is. They haven't proved that so far. That's the central issue we have here. So the problem for us, there's two issues here. The one I concentrate on, which is the kind of like actually hopefully illuminating the evidence and the issues. At least on psychiatry, even though I take it in obviously a radical direction, a lot of us do the same work here. But the other one is like, well, okay, what is this thing that psychiatry has been calling mental illness? Some people talk about madness, and madness historically, it had a much wider, broader context. We used to understand it as kind of like, kind of God speaking through us, or spiritual guidance, or kind of like some sort of issue with the humours, or some deep melancholy, etc. All these proliferation of different ideas that's been reduced to this biomedical reductionist idea that there's something inside us, which hasn't been proven. So, in terms of what to do, well, there's lots of work to be done in terms of like, like my previous narratives research was, I just kind of talked to people who'd been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, and I kind of like just asked them to, to talk about their experiences, how they feel they got ill, how they possibly recovered from that, and we can learn from, I think, these people as the experts on their condition. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to get around this naming thing because the hegemony, the dominance of the idea of mental illness, particularly now in this society, is so powerful. I have to say, it's fantastic. Psychiatry's been an incredible success, and it's very impressive when you kind of like, you look at the evidence versus the expansion. It's kind of a one way, it's kind of, wow, that's really incredible.
That's great stuff there.
I was just reading, this, maybe this falls along with something I was thinking about throughout your talk, was the whole kind of positive psychology movement. So you've got like the birth of like self-actualization, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This idea too that like our goal is to be happy, and therefore if you're not happy, there's something wrong with you. And I just read this fascinating study in the Journal of Personality, the Social Personality. It's like one of the top psychology journals. I keep forgetting its name now, but they were tracking by their own measure people's rates of self-esteem actually declined over the course of the self-esteem movement. So like, it actually hurt people, which was fascinating. So it was like, and I think it maybe ties to like, maybe it's not even just professionals exerting labeling and power and stuff, but it's this self-diagnosis issue too, of like, oh, I'm not happy, therefore there must be something wrong with me. I can't afford to go to a doctor, but like I know a plethora of popular diagnoses I can choose from in popular culture that will explain why I'm broken.
Absolutely, and this feeds into the Foucauldian Nicholas Rowe's idea of basically, we kind of need these professionals. Yes, it might be a social construction. Yes, there might be incredible problems with the evidence, etc. But fundamentally, why do we have these professionals here? We kind of like, it's a kind of like negotiating power relation. And yes, we have, in the kind of like advanced neoliberalism, etc., we actually need these services. This is actually a positive thing for us. Obviously, I go in a different direction, but there is kind of work on psychologization of society, etc., and there's critical text around psychology and therapy as well, which there are also some references in my book as well. I just want to move on, and you've been waiting a while too.
Yeah, so I'm still trying to get back to the question that was asked. It almost feels like it would be valuable to have some kind of categories we could throw these different diagnoses into, and I don't know if you agree with that, but it seems like there are those diagnoses that seem to come from, I mean, they're all going to come from a place, but I have like 5 different questions I'm trying to wrap into one. And one of them is I read Levi Strauss yesterday with my class, and the efficacy of symbols, right? And this whole thing is that the social disease gets cured by a social practice, right? And so there's a sense in which I feel like that's some of what you're describing here. And so, like as an anthropologist, there's a kind of the moment of, none of this is surprising. There's also sort of the functionalist tradition that, that's kind of, you look at cultures around the world, and that's kind of how it works. If somebody doesn't fit into whatever is needed in that society, then they're going to be labeled in some way as deviant or whatever. So it seems quite somewhat unexpected, right, to find this sort of match now where it gets surprising, of course, the psychiatrists themselves have a particular claim, but so do, the shaman, right? The shaman will tell the story about how this is actively curing, and Levi Strauss's analysis, at least, would give you a different take on that. So, I don't know, it just feels to me, I guess the thing that I'm most anxious about is that the potential for dismissal of your suffering, right? Of somebody that says, I suffer from this, and then you say, oh, it's just all made up.
Social effect.
It's just, it's not real. It's a social construction. This thing you say, and there's that sense of, in the Freudian sense of, we perfect our illnesses, right? It's like, it's me. That's part of me. So, like I said, that's about 5 different questions.
Can I jump off of what he's saying?
Absolutely.
I have some issues and questions too. And maybe it's hard to articulate this. I hope I can do it. I think the danger in approaching it this way is that very thing. Is that there are people that are challenged with different conditions. And if you've had family members or students that are dealing with this, you know that's reality. What I like about this is that, yes, it's time to reevaluate the whole practice of psychology and psychiatry. But I think, in my mind, the political and economic elite, as well as the psychological sciences, are victims of a broader thing outside your circle diagram. And maybe I'm getting back to the Marxist thing that capitalism makes us all sick. And that is that the possibility that our human frail bodies are not capable to adapt as quick as we need to adapt to what society is evolving into, given the technological age. And I could give you all kinds of examples of students that are addicted to web stuff and it's interfering with their schoolwork. Or just too much constant stimulation. So I think all of this is a product, I guess this is the anthropological approach, to categorize, to put things in different categories of mental illness is a product of our culture. It's what we do. Other cultures don't do it that way. And but the danger, I want to know how you're going to balance. This kind of goes off your question. The danger of approaching it this way is how do you deal with the reality of people who are suffering?
Yeah, well, there's so I'm trying to remember the connection because so there's Johann Hari's book, for instance. It's not the only one. It's just one that really came to mind just then with your question, and now I'm thinking about Bonnie Burstow's book as well. These are two people who go through the scientific evidence, come to the central conclusions of mine, not the Marxist stuff in that direction, but comes to the same conclusions. So basically, you know, this is pseudoscience. We kind of like we're being fed stuff that actually kind of basically they can cause us harm. So medicine can cause us harm through this, you know, antidepressants, etc. ECT, no idea how it works, etc. Still giving it out. All these kind of like treatments are incredible. There's a modern version of lobotomy and so forth. So, in this context of people looking at it, of course, like I have my answers, they have their different answers. Johann Hari says what we're lacking in this society, and I think this kind of appeals to a lot of us in a way, is actually what are real antidepressants, as he puts it, is actually communities, collective action, something that basically has been fragmented and kind of destroyed by neoliberalism. You know, the idea that actually, as people, we have more in common than we have kind of, somebody was talking about basically, they're kind of like our views on human nature, and you know, I believe that people are fundamentally good, but put into difficult situations. Yeah, so Johann Hari does a lot in his book. He's a journalist, actually, about basically, and he gives examples about the way people and their conditions, they're being kind of like given a diagnosis of schizophrenia or something, stuff like this, and in a kind of community, and then they have this kind of collective action because something goes on, like there was a threat to chuck these people out of their rented accommodation in Berlin, and they actually set up a kind of direct action against it, and it involves more people. And actually, and I've heard lots of these stories around, maybe you guys have as well, around the Occupy movement. Actually, we had an Occupy movement as well, smaller than ones in the US, and people with like mental health problems. And this seemed to be, from what other people were saying, was actually a really positive therapeutic thing. For these people to actually feel you're not isolated, you're not alone. Lots of things that we all actually are dealing with in this kind of society are being alienated in our work. Another one, Bonnie Burstow, these are just a couple of examples amongst a whole number of others. There are critical psychiatrists that take this line and then they say, well, we have to rethink how we work with people and stuff. And so, for instance, you can look at the network of the Critical Psychiatry Network in the UK. That's a whole bunch of people. Tim and me talks about, reasons why we have kind of like all these young people labelled as ADHD is because of the culture, the changing cultural environment. And I think that would kind of appeal and fit into your ideas of social media, kind of technologies, things moving faster now, etc. Rapid fire culture and stuff like this can lead to environmental factors leading to problems. Bullying on the internet and all the rest of it. Bonnie Burstow does a really interesting discussion. She's basically, she calls herself an anti-psychiatrist. I don't, because I'm a Marxist, I guess. And anti-psychiatrists always thought was Lang and Cooper were much too reformist in their views. But anyway, as an anti-psychiatrist, she follows these kind of social constructionist lines. And then she says, okay, well, what do we do? And she spends a lot of time actually looking at, she's a therapist herself, some sort of humanist therapist. And she talks about again, communal stuff, we all need to be involved in people who need help, etc., rather than we rely on these professionals that we know can make people a lot worse. What do we actually do with kind of like, how do we help people? What do we do when we have a problem and stuff? So cases like that. Just because, I am explaining, like all Marxists do, I guess, the society we live in, as well as hopefully some ideas of how we can go beyond that concludes my book. But nevertheless, you can take a functionist view. You can say, well, this is the way society is. From my point of view, what you have when you look at kind of like the power disparities, the way this society is set up, the fundamental inequalities, what you have, same as the kind of like the prison system. US prison system, fantastic example. Our prison system in New Zealand, also a fantastic example. We have kind of the biggest population locked up next to you guys per capita, I believe it or not. Welcome to New Zealand. But similar to the prison system doesn't work. We know that fundamentally. We know kind of like if anything, it just creates more crime. And of course it's focused on specific populations, black populations, etc. Laws are put in place to basically lock up black people. The kind of war on drugs is a war on black people. So in the same way, this is what's happening with this thing. So I don't think, I would certainly not argue that this is just the status quo is how it is, because we see this in every society. We can, we deinstitutionalized after all. So the psychiatric hospitals did disappear, which I think fundamentally is a good thing. More or less disappear. But you can do the same with the criminal justice system. You can get rid of those prisons. The reason they're kept is because there's a lot of crime pays. For the whole prison system and stuff, They do not work for people, they don't work for us.
Can I just follow up? And maybe we're saying the same thing, I'm not sure, but I think this goes beyond capitalism. Because you can have industrialization without capitalism. Okay? It's the driving forces of industrialization versus agricultural. I'm coming from a farm background and seeing how things happen from my grandfather's generation onward.
Okay.
And he would be diagnosed with ADHD for sure, and so would my father, and PTSD if we know what that was.
Why is that?
I have accounts of him as a child from his sister, and he was sent off to live with his uncle on an Indian reservation because of his hyperactivity, although we didn't know what that was. But what I'm trying to get to is that as our society changes, as it's driven by the technological change that we're experiencing, we become more and more confined and not allowing for deviancy. He could go off and grow up and become cowboy in Belfouche and be just fine. But that's not possible anymore. And the more we become driven by computer technology and the way computers are limited in how they think and how they define the reality around them, we are becoming more confined. And that causes these problems for some people. And it isn't just capitalism, because these computerization and technological advancement is happening in different types of economies. It isn't just capitalism. Okay? And that it's those driving forces that are narrowing what's acceptable as acceptable behavior. Right? and allowing less allowance or flexibility as we used to have
Yeah.
for people who are a little bit different, including Australians, so,
And New Zealanders.
and New Zealanders.
And we have to wind up now. Actually, this has been most illuminating. Let's thank our speakers.